What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, the Indian superstars Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh D are going to battle it out in an absolutely insane game taken from the 2024 Canada's tournament in Toronto, Canada. And personally, I am Team Pragg, but I like Gukesh D as well. Alright, in the game, Praggnanandhaa 1d4 is the first move, then d5, c4, and e6, the queen's gambit declined. Now, instead of knight c3 heading for an exchange variation, Pragg does go knight to f3, then we have knight f6, and finally g3, the Catalan Opening on the board. Now here, Gukesh, bishop b4 is the move, a very popular choice, and the main line here is bishop d2, then bishop e7. That would be the starting point of the Closed Catalan. However, instead, in the game, Praggnanandhaa, he drops a bombshell. He actually goes knight to c3, and this is the line that Magnus Carlsen did play against Hans Niemann in their famous cheating scandal match in the 2022 Cyclefeld Cup. So this position is very, very well known. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, he's basically playing a pawn sacrifice. Gukesh will have the option of taking on c4 and hanging on to that pawn basically forever, and that is what happens in the game. So d takes c4, now bishop g2, and both sides do castles. So castles and castles on the board for Praggnanandhaa. Now here, Gukesh, again, he has that extra pawn. That is a huge asset in this position, and his plan is to hang on to it with the moves a6 and b5 at some point. Meanwhile, Praggnanandhaa, he will have to fight for compensation for the pawn, and the main way to do that is to go e4, and then potentially e5 or d5 at some point, fighting for initiative in the center and potentially starting an attack against the black king. Alright, here, Gukesh, he finds the strongest idea, knight c6, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on d4. This is possible as d takes c4 was already played. And now, for example, if the queen moves to, say, c2 or a4, then there is a lot of pressure on d4. That would be risky. Now here in this position, Praggnanandhaa, he does just go a3, driving back that bishop. Of course, there were other options. For example, knight e5 was playable, and believe it or not, queen a4 is also playable. However, in the game, a3 on the board, driving back the bishop. All right, here, Gukesh, bishop e7 is the move. That is the strongest idea here. You technically can take on c3. Bishop takes c3 is a playable move. However, after that, Praggnanandhaa does get a very, very stable pawn center, and he would have those two b's on c1 and g2, and those two bishops would be a huge asset in the game. So instead, bishop e7 on the board, the strongest move by far. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, he continues his plan. The only good move here, e4, expanding in the center, and now he does have those very strong pawns on d4 and e4, sort of in the spirit of the king's gambit opening. Now again, his main plan is to develop and then go e5 or d5 at some point, starting the attack. Now here, Gukesh, he starts his plan. a6 on the board, the strongest move by far, setting up b5 ideas, and then potentially bishop b7 and knight to a5. That is the optimal placement of his pieces. Once he gets that set up, that pawn on c4 will be his forever. The bishop on b7 will be super, super active, putting a lot of pressure on that pawn on e4, and it will be harder for Praggnanandhaa to start the attack. All right, now Praggnanandhaa, the next step in his plan features getting that bishop on c1 out to a good square. And it turns out both e3, f4, and g5, these are all good squares. In the game, Praggnanandhaa does go bishop e3, a perfectly fine move. And here, Gukesh, he continues his plan with the very strong move b5, gaining space on the queen's side. Of course, there were other ideas. You could go knight a5 immediately, and even knight g4, putting pressure on that bishop on e3 was playable, but instead, b5, this is the main line. And again, the plan here for Gukesh, bishop b7, putting pressure on that pawn on e4, and then knight to a5, potentially threatening knight b3 at some point in the future. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, this is a very critical point in this game. How does he want to continue the attack? Well, here, both d5 and e5 are sort of playable. The computer likes the idea of h4, as usual, the alpha 0 pawn, and then following up knight g5. Instead, in the game, Praggnanandhaa, he does go queen to e2. And his idea here, he wants to go queen e2, then rook d1, putting the rook opposite the black queen on d8, and then the e5 and d5 threats will be a lot more dangerous. All right, here, Gukesh, in the game, bishop b7 is the move, the best idea by far. Of course, knight to a5 was also playable if you follow up with the move bishop b7 on the next move, but overall, bishop b7 a little bit more flexible. Now, Praggnanandhaa, he does go rook a to d1, again, putting his rook opposite the black queen on e8. Perhaps he may go rook e1 in the future, or perhaps he may leave the rook on the f1 square, potentially setting up f4 ideas at some point in the future. That may be an idea. Now here, Gukesh, obviously, he does follow up with the move knight to a5. That was the entire point of his setup. Now he has the optimal placement of virtually all of his pieces. The knight on a5, the pawns on a6, b5, and c4. And of course, that light-squared bishop on b7, slicing down the board, putting pressure on e4 if I can draw arrows correctly. So now, knight takes e4 is a very real threat. That would win a pawn on e4. And now here, Praggnanandhaa, he has to find a way to defend the pawn. He already moved the bishop once to e3. Therefore, moving the bishop once again to say f4 or g5 would not make a lot of sense. That would be a waste of tempo. Therefore, here, Praggnanandhaa, he basically has to go for the attack right now. So what's the right idea? Well, it turns out e5 is not a good move. Then after knight d5, the center is relatively closed, and Gukesh would have a very good defensive setup. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the best sequence of moves here for Praggnanandhaa in this position. And while you're at it, if you're enjoying this video and want to see more Gukesh versus Praggnanandhaa content, smash that YouTube like button for me. Thank you so much. All right, here, the key idea for Praggnanandhaa, and he finds it in a heartbeat. First, you go d5. Then black is virtually forced to take on d5. You can't allow d takes e6. That would be a very big threat. For example, if Gukesh goes queen to e8, then d takes, f takes, then knight to g5, putting pressure on that pawn on e6 would be very dangerous for Gukesh. That is exactly what Praggnanandhaa wants here. So instead, e takes d5 is the move. And now here, Praggnanandhaa, believe it or not, he is not forced to take back on d5. Yes, e takes and knight takes are playable moves. Praggnanandhaa would have an okay position, but Praggnanandhaa is a madman at the chessboard. And here he plays his key idea, e5, breaking in the center. Now, let's rewind just a little bit here. In this position right here, Praggnanandhaa does not go e5 first, then the knight could jump into d5. Instead, d5 is the move, forcing e takes, and only then he goes e5. The idea being, this is a second pawn sacrifice. You're giving up that pawn on the d file, going to d5, but now the knight cannot go to d5. The knight has to go somewhere else. And where is the knight going to go? Well, this is the key idea of the pawn sacrifice. You're not giving that knight on f6 a good square to go to. d5 is already covered by the pawn. So in the game, Gukesh, he finds the only good move, knight to e8. Instead, knight g4 would not be very good. Then you just go bishop f4, rook e1, and so on, and you have a great game. Instead, knight to e8 on the board, the best square for the knight, but now look at the knight. That knight is very awkwardly placed. Obviously, the pawn on e5 covers both d6 and f6. c7 is not available right now. The pawn covers that. The knight is basically trapped on the back rank. All right, now, Praggnanandhaa, in this position, he has many different attacking ideas that he can use to follow up. For example, real fast, knight d4 followed by f4 is a pretty playable idea. You can also go knight to h4, intending knight to f5, and bishop takes h4 is not that big of a threat. Beyond that, you can also go h4, intending potentially h5 or knight to g5. That would be a favorite of the computer program Alpha 0. However, instead here, Praggnanandhaa, he came prepared. I think this move was still in his preparation for this game. He still had these lines ready, I assume. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But in this position here, Praggnanandhaa, he plays the strongest move by far, e6, technically a third temporary pawn sacrifice. Praggnanandhaa, I'm telling you, this guy is an absolute madman at the chessboard. All right, what is the idea? Well, if black takes the pawn, let's say f takes e6, at that point, he would literally be up 3 pawns in the position. But Praggnanandhaa, his idea, starting bishop to f4, and that would open up the attack on the pawn. And if Gukesh tried to defend, say, bishop c8, the bishop now defending the pawn on e6, then rook f to e1, and suddenly Pragg would have all of his pieces perfectly placed, and Gukesh, most of his pieces would be on the back rank, and it would be a really awkward defensive setup. So that was Praggnanandha's idea with this move e6. Instead here, Gukesh does play the move f5. This turns out to be quite a bit weaker, and it turns out f takes e6, taking the third pawn was the right idea. However, Gukesh, he didn't like that. He's an active player as well. He tries to gain space on the king side and doesn't gobble up that third pawn. But here, Praggnanandhaa, he finds the best idea. Knight to e5, jumping in with the knight, and now the knight has access to both the d7 and the f7 squares. The knight could literally jump into either of those squares at any moment. For example, if he goes knight d7, that rook on f8 will be trapped. Obviously, the knight covers f8 and f6, and f7 is covered by the pawn. So that would be very, very dangerous, and knight f7 would also be dangerous, hitting the queen on d8. All right, now, Gukesh, knight to f6 is the move, taking advantage of the drawback of the move e6. Of course, that move does give up control of the f6 and d6 squares. Therefore, the knight can now jump back to the very strong f6 square. So Gukesh playing fabulously so far in this game. All right, Praggnanandhaa, how does he want to continue the attack here? Obviously, he is down 2 full pawns here, and that pawn on e6 is very vulnerable as well. Therefore, Praggnanandhaa has to find the right continuation. Well, there are a few decent ideas. Knight to f7 is one playable move. The computer also likes the move rook f to e1. That is the top stockfish engine line. However, instead in the game, Praggnanandhaa, he does go queen to c2, putting pressure on that pawn on f5. And this is just speculation on my part, but I think this is where both players were outside of the preparation. Here, Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh, I think for sure, were thinking on their own in this game. Now, the computer doesn't like this move, queen to c2. You can see the eval bar on the left dropping a little bit. However, don't take that at face value. This position is just incredibly dangerous. Praggnanandhaa has a very dangerous attack over the board. This is what he wanted. All right, Gukesh here. What should he be doing? Well, it turns out the strongest idea is c5, gaining space on the queen side and threatening d4 with the fork on the bishop and the knight on c3 and e3. That would be a very dangerous idea. Instead, in the game, Gukesh does go c6, playing a little more defensively. Now he has a very interesting, it's not even a diamond, it's diamond +1 on the queen side. You don't see that very often with those pawns on the queen side. But now here, Praggnanandhaa, he just gobbles up that pawn on the f5 square. Queen takes f5, and he's not concerned about d4 ideas. Again, that pawn not being supported by the pawn on c5 sufficiently. So here, Gukesh, what is his idea? Well, in the game, he just goes queen to e8, and this is a very, very strong move, getting off the d-file and setting up future d4 ideas. And beyond that, if Praggnanandhaa ever goes knight to f7, for example, then Gukesh will have the option of going rook takes f7, giving up the rook for the knight and the pawn after e takes, then queen takes. So here, Gukesh, he's setting up a future exchange sacrifice idea on the f7 square, giving up the exchange, aka the rook for the minor piece, if he needs it. All right, now Praggnanandhaa, again, he has to find the right continuation. It turns out, in this position, he actually has very good long-term compensation for the one missing pawn, and he can start to slow play the attack a little bit and get the rest of the pieces into the game. So, for example, the engine loves the idea of rook to e1, then knight to e2, knight to f4, maybe even knight to h5 in the future, and so on, getting both the rook and the knight into the attack. Instead, here in this position, Praggnanandhaa, he goes right into Gukesh's trap. He jumps in with the knight to f7, Pragg going for the attack in this position. However, the knight on f7, it doesn't really attack anything yet. For example, that queen on e8, it already got out of the attack of the knight by swinging over to e8 instead of being on d8. So what is Praggnanandha's idea? Well, it turns out in the future he may have knight to h6 ideas, giving up the knight to open up the king side, and beyond that, that knight on f7 is a nuisance in the black position. However, if Gukesh responds perfectly, it's not that big of a deal. Now, this is another good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and find the right idea for Gukesh. All right, the idea here, you can actually give up the rook on f7 for the knight, the exchange sacrifice, aka giving up the rook for the knight and the pawn. So, rook takes, e takes, then queen takes would be a very good sequence for Gukesh. He'd have a very good position. However, instead, he doesn't do that. In the game, he does go bishop c8, and this was part of the idea of c6 earlier, bolstering all those pawns with the c-pawn, allowing the bishop to go back to the c8 square without dropping d5. So that was the idea of c6 earlier in the game, and now Gukesh does continue his idea. However, the problem with this move, it's a little bit passive, and now both the rook and the knight on the a file are basically out of the game, and here Praggnanandhaa, he still has time to build up the attack. All right, in the game, rook f to e1 for Praggnanandhaa, the right move, getting his last piece into the attack, that being the rook on the e1 square, formerly the f1 square. Now here, once again, Gukesh, his strongest idea is the rook sacrifice, aka the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes f7, giving up the rook for the knight and the pawn after e takes, queen takes. However, in the game, again, he doesn't play that. Instead, knight to b7 on the board, rerouting the knight back into the game. And now this is a solid move. Here, the knight has access to both d6 and c5. Gukesh clearly understands when you're defending, you need to get all the pieces into the attack. Just like when you're attacking, you must get all the pieces into the attack. But here, Praggnanandhaa, he has a brilliant move at his disposal, capitalizing on the slow move knight to b7. And here, once again, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and find the right idea. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, believe it or not, he can play the move rook takes d5. That is as close as you're ever going to get to a clean sacrifice of the rook. The idea is rook takes, c takes, then knight takes, and suddenly with your knight infiltrating into the game, you get a very dangerous attacking position, especially with that long diagonal opening up and that Catalan bishop on g2 just being a monster, opening up threats even against the rook on a8 via the x-ray attack. Instead, Praggnanandhaa, he did not play rook takes d5 in the game. That would have been absolutely bonkers. Instead, the move was bishop g5, a very playable move, putting more pressure on that knight on f6. Now here, Gukesh, the strongest idea is going to be knight to c5, getting the knight into the game and threatening knight d3. At that point, that knight would clog up the d-file. It would be a huge asset for Gukesh. Instead, in the game, rook to a7 is the move. A very curious idea, activating the rook on the 7th rank, and now the rook could defend there. If the knight goes to c5, the rook would have access to the e7 square, for example. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, what should he be doing here? Once again, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and find the right solution. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, he has two options. The first option is you can take on d5 immediately with the bishop sacrifice. The other option is you can take on f6 first and then go for the bishop sack. In the game, Praggnanandhaa does go for the second option. Bishop takes f6 first, removing that knight on the f6 square. Then bishop takes, and finally here, Praggnanandhaa, he plays the nuclear bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes d5 on the board, giving up his Catalan bishop, but in the process, blowing open the black queenside and center. All right, in the game here, Gukesh, he does go c takes d5 real fast. You do have the option of playing the intermediate move, bishop takes c3, removing that knight on c3. The idea being after b takes, you take back with the c pawn, c takes d5, and then obviously knight takes d5 won't be a possibility as that knight won't even be there. However, if Gukesh played bishop takes c3, then here Praggnanandhaa has the intermediate move, knight to h6 check, an unbelievable idea. The idea being after g takes, you can go e7 check, with the discovered attack on the king by the bishop, and the pawn also threatens the rook. That would be just absolute chaos on the board. That is not what happened. Instead, in the game, Gukesh did take on d5, c takes d5, the safer move, respecting Praggnanandhaa's threats, and now, of course, knight takes d5, jumping in with the knight. And now, just look at Praggnanandhaa's attacking position here. The knight on d5 and f7, the queen on f5, the pawn on e7 being a key attacking piece, and those rooks on e1 and d1. This is exactly what Praggnanandhaa wanted for this game. Of course, all is not lost for Gukesh. Keep in mind, he has the extra minor piece here. He has 1, 2, 3 minor pieces versus the 1, 2 knights of Praggnanandhaa. So in return, Praggnanandhaa does have that pawn on e6 and very good attacking chances. However, again, if Gukesh can defend, he may have a winning endgame. All right, here in this position, Gukesh, that pawn on b2 is hanging. Can you take it? It turns out, yes, you can, but in the game, Gukesh plays a more defensive move, bishop to e7. And these two moves are equally good. Both bishop e7 and bishop takes b2 are both very playable. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, what should he be doing in this position? Well, once again, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, try to find the right solution for Praggnanandhaa right here. Well, it turns out Praggnanandhaa can actually play the nuclear knight sacrifice, knight to h6, blowing open the king side. The idea being, if you take the knight, then queen to g4 hits the king, and there are just so many different threats against the black king. Those lines are wild. If you like investigating lines on your own, I definitely recommend checking out knight to h6. That would be an insane idea, and it is the strongest move in this position according to the engine. Instead, in the game, Pragg did play queen to g4, the idea being setting up that knight to h6 threat as the pawn on g7 would be pinned to the king. However, this move is quite a bit slower, and it does give Gukesh time to centralize his pieces. Here in the game, he finds the best move, knight to d8, finally challenging that knight on f7, and now both the knight and the rook are being activated. All right, Praggnanandhaa, how is he going to continue the attack? In the game, he does take on d8, knight takes d8 is the move. However, instead, queen d4 followed by knight to h6 may have been a stronger idea. Again, you can investigate that on your own. That line is very, very complicated. Instead, knight takes d8 on the board. Now Gukesh does take back with the bishop. Bishop takes d8, a very interesting move. The idea being now the rook is fully activated all the way to the g7 square, and now Praggnanandhaa, he is running out of threats in this position. Can he keep the attack going, or is Gukesh just defending perfectly here? All right, let's find out. In the game, Praggnanandhaa, queen d4, increasing pressure on that g7 pawn and opening up the attack on the rook on the a7 square. Now, rook b7 is forced. We can go rook b7 or say rook to e7, but either way, you got to move the rook out of the attack. Now here, Praggnanandhaa, rook to e4, activate the rook on the 4th rank, potentially going rook to g4 in the future, again piling up threats on that g7 pawn. But now here, Gukesh, bishop to f6 is the move, and that bishop does oppose a lot of Praggnanandhaa's attacking ideas in this position. Here, Praggnanandhaa, if he just takes that bishop, say, knight takes, then rook takes would be the move. One more piece flies off the board, and Praggnanandhaa, his attack would be slowing down, and Gukesh would have that extra minor piece, that bishop on c8, and that may be enough to decide the game. So here, Praggnanandhaa, obviously, he does not trade the knight for the bishop. Instead, queen to e3. He continues the attack. He knows he needs as many pieces on the board as possible to try and fight for a win here. But now Gukesh, he just plays bishop e7, a very good defensive move. He's defending flawlessly. And now Praggnanandhaa, what else can he do to continue the attack? I mean, f4 to f5 is not really a viable strategy. That would weaken the king side too much. So here, Praggnanandhaa, he finds the only good practical idea. And again, if you like puzzles, try and pause the video and try to find the idea of Praggnanandhaa in this position to keep the attack going. It's not necessarily the top engine line, but I love this move. And while it may not be the strongest move according to the engine, it is my favorite move on the chessboard, and it is the best practical idea in this position. That is my one hint for you, my friend. All right, here, Praggnanandhaa, of course, he pushes Prince Harry, the h-pawn, down the board, His Royal Highness, the alpha 0 pawn. Here we go. Now, queen to c6. And of course, Praggnanandhaa, when in doubt, you just push that h-pawn off the board. h5 is the move. All right, Gukesh, bishop c5, hitting the queen on e3. Praggnanandhaa obviously has to move the queen. Queen to g5 is the move. Now his threat is h6, and that pawn on g7 would be pinned to the king. The alpha 0 pawn, once again, is Praggnanandhaa's last hope. But here, Gukesh, he takes the pawn on e6. Bishop takes e6. That pawn was hanging. The bishop is defended by the queen on c6. And now Praggnanandhaa, what is he supposed to do? Well, again, when in doubt, you push that alpha 0 pawn all the way to h6. h6 on the board. But here, Gukesh, he is not amused. He's not phased. He's not seeing ghosts. In this position, he plays the final blow of the game. Rook takes f2. Fly in with the rook. Now the threat, of course, is ideas like rook to f5 with a discovered attack by the bishop on the king. Here, Gukesh, he's up a minor piece and a pawn. That is just too much. The attack is over, and for that reason, in this position, Praggnanandhaa, he is forced to resign to Gukesh in the 2024 Canada's tournament. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button for more Gukesh vs. Praggnanandhaa content. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Gukesh and Arjun Erigaisi, the two top Indian superstars, battle it out in an absolutely insane Sicilian defense game. I think you're going to love that video. And by the way, I am not an AI robot, and I'll see you in the next video.